On the corner of a massive oak desk sat a faded, weathered, and unassuming photograph. It was the kind of thing most people might glance at and forget. Yet, that photograph was impossible to ignore for Jason Miller, a sharp-eyed intern at Whitmore Industries. As the youngest and most ambitious hire in a company renowned for relentlessly pursuing perfection, Jason was used to details. But this time, it wasn't a spreadsheet or a memo catching his attention. It was a face. A woman's face. The chestnut hair, soft eyes, and delicate smile looked achingly familiar. It struck Jason like a flash of lightning. The woman in the photograph was his mother. A woman he'd always believed had no connection to this towering corporate empire or its enigmatic CEO, Daniel Whitmore. Jason couldn't move. Questions clawed at his mind. What was his mother's picture doing here? Why had she never mentioned Daniel, who built Whitmore Industries from the ground up? And why did the image exude an intimacy that didn't belong in the sterile walls of a corporate office? As Jason leaned in closer, the office door creaked open. Daniel's deep voice, equal parts authority and mystery, interrupted the moment. "Jason," he said, his piercing blue eyes locking onto the young man. "Is something wrong?" Caught off guard, Jason stammered an excuse and hurried out, his mind racing. He didn't know it yet, but that single photograph had just unlocked a door to a labyrinth of family secrets, buried truths, and revelations that would challenge everything he thought he knew about himself, his mother, and the world around him. Dear viewers, are you ready to unravel the mystery with Jason? What lies behind that photograph? How deep do the secrets run, and how far will they take him? Don't miss the gripping journey of love, betrayal, and redemption that's about to unfold. Subscribe now to uncover the truth alongside Jason and to follow more stories that will leave you questioning what you thought you knew about family, loyalty, and the human heart. The story is just beginning, and you won't want to miss a moment. Jason's steps echoed down the gleaming corridor of Whitmore Industries as he retreated from Daniel's office. His heart thudded loudly in his chest, each beat fueled by a mix of confusion, anxiety, and an inexplicable sense of betrayal. The photograph felt like a loose thread threatening to unravel the fabric of his entire life. As Jason sat at his desk, his hands hovered over the keyboard, but his mind wasn't on the quarterly reports or client data. Instead, it replayed the moment he saw the photograph, the softness in Daniel Whitmore's voice as he addressed him, and the flicker of something, was it regret, that crossed the older man's face when their eyes met. Jason had grown up with a single mother, Emma, who rarely spoke about the past. She was a warm and fiercely loving woman, but her silence about Jason's father had always hung like a shadow over their otherwise happy home. Anytime Jason had asked about him, Emma's response had been vague and brief. "He's gone, sweetheart. It's just us now, and that's all we need." Over the years, Jason had learned to stop asking, but the questions never went away. Sitting under his cubicle's fluorescent lights, Jason felt a new urgency to confront those unanswered questions. That photograph was proof. His mother wasn't just a stranger to the man at the helm of Whitmore Industries. She had been a part of his life, deeply enough to display her image in a place of honor on his desk. The thought gnawed at Jason as he glanced across the room toward Daniel's office. The polished door seemed to hold the answers he desperately wanted but couldn't yet demand. That evening, Jason returned to the modest apartment he shared with Emma. The smell of roasted vegetables and thyme greeted him, a comforting contrast to his day's sterile work atmosphere. Emma hummed softly in her worn apron as she stirred a pot on the stove. "Hey, honey," she said brightly when she saw him, but her smile faltered when she caught the tension in his expression. "Long day." Jason hesitated, unsure how to broach the topic that had consumed his thoughts. He took a deep breath, summoning the courage to ask the question that had been burning in his mind since he'd left Whitmore Industries. "Mom," he began cautiously, "did you ever know Daniel Whitmore?" Emma froze mid-stir, her hand gripping the wooden spoon tightly. Her back remained to him, but Jason saw her shoulders tense. The silence stretched unbearably before she finally turned, her face pale and eyes wide with unease. "Why do you ask?" she said, her voice higher than usual, her smile forced. Jason leaned against the kitchen counter, crossing his arms. I saw a photograph on his desk today. It was of you, wasn't it? Emma's lips parted, but no words came out. She gripped the counter's edge for support, the color draining from her face. Jason pressed on, his voice sharper now. Why was your picture on his desk, Mom? Who is he to you? To us? Emma closed her eyes, exhaling shakily as she lowered herself into a chair. Her hands trembled as she clasped them together. Jason, she began softly, there are things I've kept from you, things I never wanted you to have to carry, but I suppose I can't hide them anymore. Jason sat across from her, his heart pounding as Emma looked at him with eyes filled with sorrow and love. She reached for his hand, her grip firm despite the tremor in her fingers. Before you were born, she began, I worked for Daniel Whitmore. I was young, fresh out of college and trying to find my way. He was everything you'd expect a man like him to be. Charismatic, ambitious, and completely out of reach for someone like me. Jason's brows furrowed. So you too? Emma nodded slowly, a bittersweet smile on her lips. It wasn't supposed to be anything serious. We came from such different worlds, and I knew that. But sometimes, the heart doesn't care about logic. Jason tried to process her words, but the idea of his mother being romantically involved with a man like Daniel Whitmore felt surreal. Did he know about me? He asked hesitantly. Emma's eyes welled with tears. No. By the time I found out I was pregnant, Daniel had already moved on. His world didn't have room for a woman like me or a child. I decided to raise you on my own. I didn't want you to grow up feeling like you were someone's burden or afterthought. Jason stared at her, emotions swirling in his chest. Anger at the man who had abandoned them, admiration for his mother's strength, and a deep sadness for everything she had endured in silence. And now, Jason asked, his voice tight, why do you think he has that photograph? Emma looked away, her expression troubled. I don't know, she admitted. I haven't spoken to him in over 2 decades. But if he's kept that photo, it means something. The room fell silent, the weight of the conversation pressing down on them. Jason clenched his fists, the questions in his mind multiplying. What kind of man was Daniel Whitmore? Did he regret leaving them behind? And why, after all these years, was he keeping Emma's photograph so prominently displayed? As Jason lay in bed that night, sleep eluded him. The image of his mother and Daniel intertwined with thoughts of his own identity. Who was he? A product of love or convenience? Did he owe this man anything? Or was it his turn to demand answers? Jason resolved to confront Daniel, but not as an intern seeking mentorship. This time, he would approach him as a son demanding the truth. Jason was determined to uncover whatever lay buried in Daniel Whitmore's past, no matter the cost. Little did he know, the photograph was just the first layer of a secret that would upend his own life and the legacy of Whitmore Industries itself. The following day, Jason walked into Whitmore Industries with quiet determination. His usual unease around the polished executives and the gleaming walls of glass and steel was replaced by a singular focus, confronting Daniel Whitmore. But this was no impulsive decision. He had spent the night strategizing, piecing together every moment and a clue to ensure he wouldn't falter. As the elevator ascended to the top floor, Jason rehearsed his words, though his palms were clammy with anticipation. He stepped out into the executive suite, where Daniel's office loomed at the end of the corridor. The receptionist, a stern woman named Claire, glanced up. Mr. Whitmore is in a meeting, she said, curt but polite. Jason nodded, but instead of turning away, he positioned himself near the window, waiting. He stared out at the sprawling city below, but his mind was consumed with the questions he needed answered. Minutes passed like hours before the office doors finally swung open. A group of executives filtered out, their faces solemn, carrying the weight of whatever decisions had been made. Daniel emerged last, his commanding presence cutting through the tension in the air. His eyes locked onto Jason, and for a fleeting moment, his composed mask slipped. Something softer, almost hesitant, flickered in his expression. Jason, he said, calm but cautious. Is there something you need? Jason straightened, his hands trembling ever so slightly. Yes, sir. I need to speak with you privately. Daniel's brow furrowed, but he nodded. Come in. Inside the office, the atmosphere was heavy. Jason couldn't help but notice the photograph again, sitting exactly where it had been the day before. It seemed to mock him now, daring him to look away. Daniel closed the door and gestured for Jason to sit, but he remained standing, his fists clenched at his sides. What's on your mind? Daniel asked, taking a seat behind the imposing mahogany desk. Jason took a deep breath, his voice steady despite the storm brewing within him. That photograph on your desk, it's of my mother, isn't it? Daniel's posture stiffened, his piercing blue eyes narrowing. For a moment, neither spoke. The tension in the room was palpable. I think you already know the answer to that, Daniel said, his voice low and measured. Jason stepped closer, his gaze unwavering. Why do you have it? What does she mean to you? And why have you never reached out? Daniel's shoulders sagged slightly as if the weight of decades suddenly bore down on him. Your mother, he began, his voice softer now. Emma was someone I cared about deeply, but there are things you don't understand, Jason. Choices I made not because I wanted to, but because I had to. Jason's jaw tightened. What choices? To abandon us? To pretend we didn't exist? Daniel sighed, leaning back in his chair. It's not that simple. Then make it simple, Jason snapped, his voice rising. You owe me that much. Daniel's eyes darkened, but instead of retaliating, he stood and walked to the window, staring at the city. Jason, there's a world you don't see. A world where power comes with a price. I thought I could have everything, Emma, a family, this empire, but I was wrong. The choices I made were to protect her. To protect you. Jason blinked, caught off guard by the emotion in Daniel's voice. Protect us? From what? Daniel turned back to face him, his expression unreadable. From the enemies I made. You don't build a company like this without stepping on dangerous ground. Some people wanted to see me fall. People who wouldn't have thought twice about hurting those I loved to get to me. Jason's anger wavered, replaced by confusion and unease. Why not tell her? Why not give her the chance to decide? Daniel's gaze softened. Because I couldn't take that risk. I thought I was doing the right thing, but looking back, I know I failed you both. Jason left Daniel's office with more questions than answers. His mind churned with everything he had heard, but he wasn't ready to accept Daniel's narrative. Protection? Sacrifice? Those words felt hollow compared to the years of silence and absence he and his mother had endured. That evening, Jason confronted Emma again, sharing Daniel's explanation. Her face paled as she listened, her hands gripping her lap tightly. When he finished, she shook her head slowly. Jason, there's more to this than what he's told you. What do you mean? Jason pressed. Emma hesitated, her eyes brimming with tears. Daniel wasn't lying about the danger, but he wasn't the only one making decisions. I made my own. Jason frowned. What kind of decisions? She inhaled deeply, her voice trembling. I begged him to leave us alone. The revelation hit Jason like a punch to the gut. You what? Why? I wanted to protect you, she said, her voice breaking. Jason, you were just a baby. I couldn't live with the constant fear of being watched, of wondering who might come after us. I told Daniel to stay away, to let us live our lives without his shadow looming over us. Jason stared at her, his chest tightening. So you both decided for me? Without ever giving me a choice. Emma's tears spilled over, but she didn't look away. I did what I thought was best. I know it wasn't perfect, but I would do it again if it meant keeping you safe. Jason felt a wave of emotions crash over him. Anger, betrayal, sorrow. He stood abruptly, pacing the small living room. And now, what do I do with all of this? Knowing that my whole life has been built on lies and half-truths. Emma stood, placing a hand on his arm. You find your truth, Jason. You decide what kind of man you want to be. But please, don't hate him or me for trying to protect you. That night, Jason sat alone in his room, the pieces of his life scattered like a jigsaw puzzle. The photograph, Daniel's regret, Emma's sacrifice. None of it fit neatly, and the edges were jagged with pain. But one thing was clear, there was more to this story. There is more to uncover. And he wouldn't stop until he had the answers. The next day, Jason decided to dig deeper, using the resources at Whitmore Industries to trace the past. He combed through old records, news archives, and internal memos, piecing together a timeline of Daniel's rise to power and the shadows that followed him. It didn't take long before a name began to surface. Project Aegis. The cryptic term appeared in financial records and confidential files, tied to significant sums of money and whispers of covert operations. Jason's heart raced as he realized this wasn't just about his family. This was about something much bigger. But just as he began to connect the dots, Jason's computer screen went dark. A single line of text appeared. "Stop digging, Jason." The message was clear, but Jason's resolve only hardened. He wasn't just uncovering a family secret. He was walking into a conspiracy that could shake the foundations of Whitmore Industries itself. Jason stared at the ominous message on his screen, his pulse quickening. The glow of his desk lamp barely illuminated the dark corners of his tiny room, but the words seemed to cast their chilling light. Stop digging, Jason. Who had sent it? How did they know what he was doing? And, more importantly, how far did this web of secrecy stretch? Jason leaned back in his chair, his mind racing. He knew one thing. Project Aegis was at the center of everything. The strange financial transactions, the layers of corporate silence, and even his family's fractured past converged on this elusive operation. But what exactly was it? Determined not to be intimidated, Jason retrieved his phone and took photos of the files he'd uncovered before they vanished from his computer. He needed a backup plan. He was getting close to something meaningful if someone tried to stop him. Something dangerous. Jason approached Daniel Whitmore's office the following day with a new sense of urgency. He bypassed Claire, ignoring her protests as he burst into the room. Daniel looked up from his desk, startled by Jason's uncharacteristic boldness. "Jason," Daniel said, his voice calm but wary. "What's going on?" Jason closed the door behind him and placed his phone on the desk, displaying the photos of the Project Aegis files. "You need to tell me the truth, Daniel. What is Project Aegis?" For a moment, Daniel's face was unreadable. Then, with a resigned sigh, he leaned back in his chair. "I was hoping you wouldn't find out about this." Jason's frustration boiled over. "Don't give me that. You've been keeping secrets my entire life. If you want me to trust you, you must stop hiding the truth." "What is it?" Daniel's piercing blue eyes locked onto Jason's. "Project Aegis is an initiative I created years ago. It started protecting the company from external threats, industrial espionage, political interference, and organized crime. But it evolved into something much larger." Jason frowned, his fists clenching. "Larger how?" Daniel hesitated before continuing. "We discovered corruption within some of our government contracts. Powerful people were exploiting those contracts for personal gain, using the company as a shield. Project Aegis was my way of gathering evidence and exposing them. But it wasn't without consequences." Jason's voice dropped, his anger giving way to disbelief. "Consequences like my mother and me?" Daniel's expression hardened. "Yes. When I realized the danger this operation posed to those close to me, I decided to push you and your mother away. I thought I could keep you safe by keeping you distant." Jason shook his head, his voice rising. "You thought? You gambled with our lives, Daniel. And for what? To play the hero in some secret war." Daniel stood abruptly, his towering frame casting a long shadow across the room. "It wasn't just a gamble, Jason. It was a necessity. If I hadn't acted, you and your mother could have been used as leverage or worse." Jason's mind reeled as he processed Daniel's words. He wanted to scream, to rage against the injustice of it all. But before he could respond, Daniel's phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen, his face darkening. "They're watching you, Jason," Daniel said grimly. "Whoever sent that message knows you're digging into things they want to stay buried." Jason's blood ran cold. Who are they? Daniel's jaw tightened. The same people who've been trying to bring me down for years. And now, they know you're involved. That evening, Jason returned home to find Emma waiting for him, her expression of concern and anger. Daniel called me, she said, crossing her arms. What are you doing, Jason? You're putting yourself in danger. Jason threw his bag onto the couch. I'm not the one who started this, Mom. You and Daniel have been keeping secrets from me my entire life. I deserve to know the truth. Emma's eyes softened, but her voice remained firm. Knowing the truth doesn't mean putting yourself in harm's way. These people, whoever they are, don't play fair. Jason stared at her, his frustration mounting. You've spent my entire life trying to protect me from shadows, but look where it's gotten us. I won't hide anymore. Emma's shoulders slumped as she sank into a chair. You're so much like him, you know? Stubborn, reckless, and brave. Jason sat across from her, his voice softer now. Mom, if you know anything about Project Aegis or these people, please tell me. Emma hesitated, her gaze flickering to the framed photo of Jason as a child on the coffee table. Finally, she spoke. There was a man, Alan Drake. He was one of Daniel's partners. He helped run Project Aegis, but something happened. One day, he just disappeared. Daniel told me to leave it alone and said it was safer. But I always felt like Alan knew something that could change everything. Jason leaned forward, his heart pounding. Do you know where I can find him? Emma shook her head. No one does. But if you're serious about this, you might start with the old Whitmore archives. They're not digital, so whoever's been watching you can't erase them. Jason returned to Whitmore Industries after hours with this new lead, using his intern badge to access the basement archives. The air was thick with dust, and the faint hum of the building's generators filled the silence. Rows of filing cabinets stretched before him like a maze, each drawer labeled with cryptic codes. Jason began searching, his fingers trembling as he sifted through files. Hours passed, and frustration started to creep in. Then, he found a folder marked Aegis, Drake. Inside were pages of handwritten notes, photographs, and memos. One document stood out, a letter from Alan Drake addressed to Daniel. Jason's breath caught as he read the words. Daniel, we've uncovered something far worse than we imagined. This isn't just about corruption or money. It's about control. If they know I've seen this, I won't survive. Protect Emma and Jason. They're your legacy now. Alan. Jason stared at the letter, his hands shaking. Alan Drake hadn't disappeared, he'd been silenced. And somehow, Jason and Emma were part of the reason. Suddenly, a noise broke the silence. A faint shuffle, like footsteps. Jason froze, his pulse racing. He shoved the folder into his bag and turned off his flashlight, crouching behind a cabinet. The footsteps grew louder, accompanied by the faint beep of a security scanner. Someone was coming. Jason held his breath as the intruder entered the archives. A beam of light swept across the room, pausing near the very cabinet Jason had been searching. The figure, a man in a black suit, opened the drawer and rifled through its contents. Jason's phone buzzed in his pocket, and the man's head snapped toward the sound. Jason bolted, his sneakers squeaking against the tile floor as he sprinted for the stairs. Shouts echoed behind him, followed by the sound of footsteps in pursuit. Bursting into the stairwell, Jason climbed frantically, his heart pounding in his chest. He reached the ground floor and slipped out into the night, his bag clutched tightly to his side. As he ran through the deserted streets, the weight of the folder felt heavier than ever. He wasn't just uncovering the truth. He was putting himself in the crosshairs of a powerful enemy. But he couldn't stop now. Not when the pieces were finally coming together. Jason barely slept that night. The folder he had retrieved from the archives sat on the small table in his apartment, its contents spread before him. The letter from Alan Drake haunted him, its cryptic warning echoing in his mind. He read and reread it, searching for hidden meanings, but the words were as stark and chilling as they had been the first time. Protect Emma and Jason. They're your legacy now. Legacy. The word felt heavy, suffocating. What had Alan meant by it? And why did it feel like the weight of Whitmore Industries, his family's secrets, and a shadowy conspiracy bore down on him immediately? Jason's thoughts were interrupted by a soft knock at the door. His body tensed. It was late, too late for visitors. He grabbed a nearby lamp, the closest thing to a weapon, and approached the door cautiously. "Who is it?" he called out, his voice steadier than he felt. "It's me," a familiar voice replied. "Sophia." Jason exhaled, relief flooding him. Sophia was a colleague from the Whitmore legal team who had always been kind to him. He opened the door to find her standing there, her usually composed expression clouded with worry. "Sophia, what are you doing here?" Jason asked, ushering her inside. She glanced nervously down the hall before stepping in. "I heard what happened," she said, her voice calm. "About the archives." "Jason, you're in over your head." Jason's eyes narrowed. "How do you know about that?" Sophia hesitated, then pulled out her phone, showing him several messages. "I've been keeping an eye on internal chatter. Someone's flagged your badge activity. They know you were in the archives last night, and they're looking for you." Jason felt a chill run down his spine. "Who's looking for me?" Sophia sat down, her voice barely above a whisper. "The board. Or at least the ones pulling the strings. Jason, you've stumbled onto something huge, bigger than you realize. Project Aegis wasn't just a defense initiative. It was the board's way of consolidating power. And Alan Drake, he found out the truth." Jason sat beside her, his mind racing. "What truth?" Sophia looked him in the eye. Aegis was designed to identify threats to Whitmore Industries, but it quickly became something more. The board used it to dig into their competitors' secrets, manipulate government contracts, and silence anyone who got in their way. Alan Drake discovered they were using it to control entire markets, and when he tried to expose them, he disappeared. Jason's heart sank. "And now they think I know too much." Sophia nodded. "You're a loose end, and if they think you're a threat." She didn't finish the sentence, but the implication was clear. Jason leaned back, the weight of her words settling over him. "Why are you telling me this? If they find out you've helped me." "I don't care," Sophia said firmly. "You deserve to know the truth. And if we're going to take them down, you're going to need help." Jason looked at her, a flicker of hope breaking through the storm of fear and confusion. "What do you mean by we?" Sophia smiled faintly. "You're not the only one who wants to see the board pay for what they've done." The next day, Jason and Sophia worked secretly, poring over the folder's contents and comparing it to the information Sophia had gathered over the years. Together, they began to piece together a picture of the board's activities, offshore accounts, bribery schemes, and shell companies tied to some of the most influential figures in government and industry. At the center of it all was Project Aegis, a tool of manipulation disguised as corporate security. "Alan was onto something big," Sophia said, pointing to a series of payments listed in the documents. "Look at this. These payments, millions of dollars, went to accounts tied to public officials. And this one," she tapped the page, "this one is linked to someone inside Whitmore Industries." Jason's eyes widened. "Someone on the inside? Who?" Sophia hesitated, then pulled up a file on her laptop. "Daniel Whitmore." Jason recoiled as if struck. "No, that doesn't make sense. He created Project Aegis to expose corruption, not be part of it." Sophia's expression softened. "Jason, I know this is hard to hear, but the evidence is right here. These payments are tied directly to his accounts. Either he was part of the cover-up, or he's been compromised." Jason shook his head, his heart pounding. "There has to be another explanation. Daniel wouldn't. He wouldn't betray his own family like that." Sophia placed a hand on his shoulder. "Then we'll find out the truth. But we have to be careful. If the board suspects we're onto them, they won't hesitate to come after us." That evening, Jason returned home to find his mother sitting at the kitchen table, her face pale and drawn. She looked up as he entered, her eyes filled with worry. "Jason," she said softly, "we need to talk." Jason sat across from her, his body tense. "What is it, Mom?" Emma hesitated, then reached for a worn envelope on the table. I wasn't honest with you before. There's something I've been hiding, something I thought I could bury. But after everything that's happened, you deserve to know." She slid the envelope across the table, and Jason opened it with trembling hands. Inside was a letter, written in a familiar hand. "Emma, if anything happens to me, give this to Jason. He'll need it to understand what's at stake. Alan." Jason looked up at his mother, his breath catching. "Alan Drake." Emma nodded, her eyes glistening with tears. "He was your godfather, Jason. He was among the few people I trusted after your father, after Daniel." Jason's mind reeled. "Why didn't you tell me this before?" Emma's voice broke. "Because I was scared. Alan warned me that knowing too much would put you in danger. But now you're already in the middle of it." Jason pulled the letter from the envelope, scanning its contents. It was a list: names, dates, accounts, all tied to the board's activities. At the bottom was a single line that sent chills down his spine. "They'll stop at nothing to keep their secrets safe. Trust no one." Jason clenched the letter in his hands, his resolve hardening. He wasn't uncovering the truth for himself anymore. He was fighting for Alan, Emma, and the legacy they had tried to protect. But with the board closing in, time was running out. If he and Sophia were to expose Project Aegis, they would have to act quickly and risk everything. The following day, Jason and Sophia met at an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of town, a place chosen for its isolation. The folder, Alan's letter, and Sophia's digital files were spread across a makeshift table. The pieces began falling into place, but one glaring question remained. Why did the board want to silence Alan Drake so desperately? "We're close," Sophia said, her voice low but firm. "The money trail leads to specific board members, but we still don't know the full extent of Project Aegis. There has to be more, something bigger than financial corruption." Jason rubbed his temples. Exhaustion etched into his features. Bigger? What could be bigger than bribery, espionage, and blackmail? Sophia hesitated, then slid a file toward Jason. "This." Jason opened the file, his eyes scanning the pages. It contained names, politicians, CEOs, journalists, all marked with dates and cryptic notes. His stomach turned as the realization hit him. "These people, they disappeared," Jason whispered, "or died under suspicious circumstances." Sophia nodded grimly. All of them were connected to Whitmore Industries in some way. Alan must have discovered that the board was using Aegis to protect the company and eliminate threats. Jason's chest tightened. And Daniel? Was he part of this? Before Sophia could answer, tires screeching outside the warehouse made them freeze. Jason rushed to the window and saw black SUVs pulling up, their headlights piercing the dim interior. Men in suits poured out, armed and moving with precision. "We've been found," Jason hissed. Sophia grabbed the files, shoving them into her bag. "We have to go. Now." The two darted through the maze of crates and machinery, the shouts of their pursuers growing louder. Jason's heart pounded as they reached a side door, only to find it blocked by two men in dark suits. "Split up," Sophia whispered urgently, shoving the bag into Jason's hands. "Take this and get out of here. I'll distract them." "No," Jason protested. "I'm not leaving you." Sophia gave him a stern look. "You have to. This isn't just about us, Jason. This is about your mother, Alan, and everyone who's suffered because of the board. Go." Reluctantly, Jason bolted toward another exit, his mind racing with fear and guilt. He could hear Sophia shouting in the distance, drawing the attention of their pursuers. He slipped through a narrow alley, clutching the bag like a lifeline. When he finally reached the safety of a deserted street, he leaned against a wall, gasping for breath. The bag felt heavier than ever, not just because of its contents but because of the burden it represented. He couldn't let Sophia's sacrifice be in vain. Jason returned to his apartment, locked the door, and closed the blinds. He spread the files out on the floor, desperate to make sense of them before the board closed in again. His phone buzzed, and his stomach dropped when he saw the caller ID. Daniel Whitmore. For a moment, Jason considered ignoring it. But something in him, perhaps the last trust he had for Daniel, compelled him to answer. Jason, Daniel's voice came through, strained but composed. I know what you've been doing. I know you were at the archives and about the files. Jason's grip tightened on the phone. Then you know what I found. Why didn't you tell me about Aegis? About Alan Drake? Daniel sighed heavily. Because it wasn't safe. You have no idea how deep this goes, Jason. If you keep digging, they'll come for you and won't stop. They already have, Jason shot back. But I'm not stopping. Not until I know the truth. There was a long pause before Daniel spoke again, his tone softening. Come to my house tonight. We need to talk face to face. Bring the files. Jason hesitated, his instincts screaming that this was a trap. But he also knew he couldn't run forever. Fine, he said finally. But if you're lying to me, Daniel, I swear. I'm not lying, Daniel interrupted. Just be careful. That evening, Jason arrived at Daniel's sprawling estate, the weight of the files still in his hands. The mansion loomed in the darkness, its grand facade somehow foreboding. A butler greeted him at the door, leading him to a study where Daniel waited. The older man stood by the fireplace, his expression unreadable. Jason, he said, gesturing for him to sit. Thank you for coming. Jason remained standing, his eyes narrowing. Cut the small talk. If you want these files, you'll tell me everything, no more half-truths. Daniel nodded, his shoulders sagging slightly. You deserve the truth. All of it. Over the next hour, Daniel revealed the full story of Project Aegis. It had begun as a noble effort to protect Whitmore Industries, but as the board gained more control, it became a weapon of power and manipulation. Daniel had tried to rein them in, but he was outnumbered and outmaneuvered. When Alan found out what they were doing, Daniel said, his voice heavy with regret, he tried to expose them. That's why they killed him. Jason's fists clenched. And my mother? Was she just another pawn in your game? Daniel's eyes softened. No. Emma was the only good thing in my life during those years. When I realized she was pregnant, I knew I had to protect both of you. That's why I sent Alan to watch over you. I thought it would keep you safe. Jason's voice shook with anger. Safe? Do you have any idea what your lies have cost us? Daniel didn't answer. Instead, he reached into his desk and pulled out a sealed envelope. This was Alan's last message to me. I think it's time you read it. Jason opened the envelope with trembling hands. Inside was a single sheet of paper. Daniel, Jason has found his way back to you if you're reading this. He's more potent than either of us ever gave him credit for. But the board won't stop until they destroy everything we've built. Protect him. And if you can, make things right with Emma. She deserves that much. Alan. Jason's vision blurred as he finished reading. For the first time, he saw the weight of Daniel's guilt and the depth of Alan's sacrifice. I want to take them down, Jason said, his voice firm. The board. Aegis. All of it. Daniel nodded, a flicker of resolve returning to his eyes. Then we'll do it. Together. The plan was audacious, dangerous, and needed more room for error. Jason, Daniel, and Sophia, who had evaded capture and rejoined the team, spent days secretly working, preparing for their showdown with the board. The files Jason had uncovered, combined with Sophia's insider knowledge, painted a damning picture of corruption, conspiracy, and murder. But exposing the truth required more than evidence. It demanded a stage big enough that no one, not even the board, could silence them. We need the press, Sophia said during one of their late-night strategy sessions. Not just a small leak. We need full, undeniable exposure. If we're going to bring them down, the world has to see everything. Daniel leaned forward, his face etched with determination. There's a shareholders' meeting next week. All the major investors, media outlets, and stakeholders will be there. If we present the evidence in front of everyone, the board won't be able to contain it. Jason nodded, but doubt gnawed at him. What if they stop us before we get there? They've already proven they'll go to any lengths. Daniel's gaze hardened. That's why we need to be prepared for anything. The day of the shareholders' meeting arrived, and tension crackled in the air like a storm about to break. The grand auditorium at Whitmore Industries was packed with hundreds of attendees, their voices blending into a low hum of anticipation. Jason, Daniel, and Sophia sat near the back, their files tucked discreetly into their bags. As the meeting began, the board took the stage, led by their chairman, Vincent Harrow. A man of polished charm and ruthless ambition, Harrow was the mastermind behind Project Aegis. He spoke confidently, outlining the company's successes and promising even greater returns for the future. Jason's hands trembled as he waited for the moment to act. When Harrow opened the floor for questions, Daniel stood, commanding the room's attention. "Mr. Harrow," Daniel began, his voice steady but sharp, "you've spoken about the company's future, but what about its past? What about Project Aegis?" A ripple of murmurs spread through the crowd. Harrow's polished demeanor faltered for a fraction of a second before he regained his composure. Project Aegis was a security initiative, a tool to protect this company and its interests. I don't see how it's relevant to today's discussion. Daniel stepped forward, his voice rising. It's relevant because it wasn't just a security initiative, was it? It was a weapon, a tool you and the board used to manipulate markets, bribe officials, and eliminate anyone who stood in your way. Gasps filled the room. Harrow's smile faded, replaced by a cold, calculated expression. "That's a serious accusation, Mr. Whitmore. Do you have proof?" Jason stood, holding up a folder. "We do." He and Sophia moved to the front of the room, distributing copies of the files to the press and attendees. Screens lit up with images of bank statements, emails, and memos, each implicating the board in a web of corruption and violence. The room erupted in chaos as reporters shouted questions and shareholders demanded answers. Harrow's mask of control shattered. "This is a baseless attack," he shouted, shaking angrily. "You have no idea what you're dealing with." Daniel stepped forward, his voice cutting through the noise. "We know exactly what we're dealing with, Harrow, and so does everyone else now." The fallout was swift and catastrophic for the board. Within hours, news of the revelations spread across media outlets, sparking outrage and investigations. Arrest warrants were issued for several board members, including Harrow, who tried to flee but was apprehended at a private airstrip. Whitmore Industries faced scrutiny, but Daniel and Jason worked tirelessly to rebuild the company's reputation. Together, they implemented reforms, dismantling the remnants of Project Aegis and instituting strict oversight to ensure nothing like it could happen again. For Jason, the journey wasn't just about justice. It was about finding his place in a world that lies and secrets had shaped. He and Sophia grew closer, their shared struggle forging a bond of trust and respect. Emma, too, found healing in the aftermath, reconnecting with Daniel in a way that brought closure to years of pain and regret. One evening, months after the board's downfall, Jason stood on the balcony of Daniel's estate, looking out at the city. The weight he had carried for so long felt lighter, though the scars remained. Daniel joined him, handing him a glass of wine. "You did good, Jason. Better than I ever could have." Jason smiled faintly. "We did it together." They stood in silence for a moment before Jason spoke again. "Alan was right, wasn't he? About everything." Daniel nodded, his gaze distant. "He always was." Jason turned to him, his voice filled with quiet determination. "I want to carry on his legacy, not just for him but for everyone who has walked in this mess. I want to make Whitmore Industries something to be proud of again." Daniel's eyes glistened with pride. "You already have." Whitmore Industries emerged from the scandal as a symbol of redemption. Under Jason's leadership, the company prioritized transparency and ethical practices, earning back the trust it had lost. Daniel stepped into an advisory role, content to let his son shape the future he had once dreamed of. For Jason, the journey had been painful, but it had also been transformative. He had uncovered the truth, faced his fears, and found his place within his family and himself. Jason reflected on how far they had come as the sun set over the city. The secrets of the past had nearly destroyed them, but in the end, they had become the foundation for something new, something more substantial. The photograph that had started it all now sat on Jason's desk, a reminder of their trials and the family they had built. It wasn't perfect, but it was real. And for Jason, that was enough.